here's another video on personal jurisdiction because one video is just not enough. This next video is on the minimum contacts test. And by the minimum contacts test here, I mean the minimum contacts test as it exists today. So not just international shoe, but how the case law has developed over all those years since 1945. Well, let me pull this up here. This is going to be a brief overview, and then we're going to expand that in separate videos. There's two kinds of ways to analyze the minimum contacts test. One, your modern basis minimum contacts. One is general jurisdiction, and the second is specific jurisdiction. And something very important to keep in mind about the minimum contacts test is that it partially overrules part of the second principle of public law. Second principle of public law from Pennoyer says that no state can exercise direct jurisdiction and authority over persons without its territory. So under Pennoyer, if you're outside the state, there's no PJ. Under international shoe, there might be. Okay, so getting back to the two bases, one basis is, where to go? Ah. There you are. General jurisdiction. So let's talk very briefly about that. General jurisdiction is also known as all-purpose jurisdiction. All-purpose jurisdiction, when it applies, means there's going to be in personam jurisdiction over the defendant, regardless of the relationship between the contacts with the state and the lawsuit. Well, as we'll discuss in a separate video, that means the contacts have to be pretty damn extensive, at home, as Dynamite tells us. The second basis for in personam jurisdiction under the modern basis, under the minimum contacts test, is specific jurisdiction. For specific jurisdiction, that is case-specific jurisdiction. In other words, the contacts themselves have to have a sufficient relationship between there has to be a sufficient relationship between the contacts with the state and the lawsuit. As Shute tells us, the contacts must give rise to the claim. And we'll talk in a separate video about the ways the courts address that. But in this short overview, I'm just going to briefly say three things. When you're analyzing minimum contacts using specific jurisdiction, there are three things that you must analyze. And analyze all three. If specific jurisdiction is implicated, do all three parts of the analysis, even if you think one part of the analysis is dispositive. All right? Number one, purposeful availment. In other words, the defendant, himself or herself or itself, has made purposeful contacts, intentional contacts with the state. Now, this is important. Sometimes people say that these contacts have to be singular isolated, or they have to be systematic and continuous, and those are both wrong. Okay? For specific jurisdiction, it may be the case that a single contact is enough. However, there can be more contacts. Generally speaking, the more extensive the contacts, the easier it is going to be to show specific jurisdiction. So it may be the contacts are single and isolated, or it may be the contacts are systematic and continuous. What matters under this first step is that there's purposeful availment, okay? And then you talk about the contacts. The second step, the contacts give rise to the claim. In a separate video, we'll talk about evidence in but for. And finally, you've got to talk about the 5 reasonableness factors, okay? Keep in mind, there's a relationship between step number 1 and step number 3. If the defendant has purposely availed itself of the forum state, then the court will presume that the exercise of jurisdiction is reasonable and shift the burden of reasonableness to the defendant. And that burden now becomes a defendant's burden of showing a compelling case of unreasonableness. Okay, that's it for that video. The next video is going to be on general in personam jurisdiction under the minimum contacts test. Thank you.